case of Roxanne Wood. The only evidence found at the crime scene was a drop of semen. It took 35 years for the victim's relatives to discover who brutally took the life of their loved one. Roxanne Wood was born on April 15, 1956, in the small town of Nels, Michigan. She was the first child in the family, followed by a younger sister, Janet. When Roxanne was 16, her younger brother Brad was born. Then, their parents' marriage began to deteriorate. When Brad was 2 years old, her parents separated and filed for divorce. The children had to split their time between their mother's and father's homes. So, Roxanne took on the role of caring for and comforting her younger siblings, Janet and Brad. Roxanne had a challenging life, but she was cheerful, friendly, and sociable as she grew up. After completing her studies at the age of 17, she started working as a manager at a small company that manufactured steel tanks, specifically in the customer service department. One day, a handsome young man came to the office. When she first saw him, Roxanne complimented him. Then they had a conversation. The young man's name was Terry Wood, and he was the boss's son. When Roxanne got home after work, she excitedly told her younger sister that it was the happiest day of her life because she had met a wonderful boy and had fallen in love with him at first sight. Roxanne and Terry began dating, and 8 years later, in 1982, they got married. The couple settled into a home in their hometown of Nels, Michigan. Both worked as managers in the customer service department of Terry's father's company. Their daily routine consisted of waking up, having breakfast, and going to work together in the same office. They would return home for lunch, take a break, go back to work, and then come home together in the evening. Roxanne told Terry that she felt suffocated by their constant togetherness. She believed that it was damaging their relationship, leading to boring arguments. Roxanne left her father-in-law's company and found a job as a manager at a plastic parts manufacturer in South Bend, Indiana. The brief separation during the day helped her and her husband maintain their relationship, and everything was going well. They began to live a normal life together. In her free time, Roxanne enjoyed cooking and often baked a variety of sweet pastries. She also loved growing roses in their yard, as she appreciated creating beauty around her. 5 years passed, and during this time, the Wood family remained childless. The couple continued to live together, work, and manage the household, unaware of the tragic fate that awaited them. On Thursday, February 19, 1987, Roxanne and Terry went to work as usual. In the evening, they each drove separately to a restaurant in downtown Niles to meet for dinner. After dinner, they decided to relax at a local bowling club with some friends. When Roxanne entered the club with Terry, she quickly attracted the attention of everyone around her because of her attractiveness and elegance. The couple enjoyed a night of bowling at the club, which was mostly filled with men. After 11 o'clock, Roxanne told her husband that it was time to go home because she had to get up early for work the next day. Terry wanted to stay and play one last round. Roxanne hugged him, kissed him, and said she was going home. Terry said goodbye and reminded her to drive carefully. Roxanne left alone while Terry stayed at the club to play one more round before driving home. He returned home about 45 minutes after Roxanne and assumed she was asleep. Terry parked his car in the garage and went into the kitchen. There, Terry witnessed a horrifying scene. His wife, Roxanne, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, her panties down to her ankles. Terry rushed to her side, hoping she was still alive. He lifted her head and tried to check her pulse, but quickly realized she was dead. In a panic, he rushed to the phone. He slipped on the bloody floor but managed to stay on his feet. He called the local police station and shouted into the phone, saying that his wife was dead in the house. Terry screamed and asked the police to come quickly, right now. The police asked Terry to calm down because they did not understand what he was saying. Terry's aggressive behavior on the phone was alarming, and when the police arrived at the Wood family home, Roxanne's death caused him to explode in rage, screaming uncontrollably. The police were forced to put him in the back of a patrol car and take him to the station for questioning. When they arrived, Terry immediately requested a lawyer, which raised further suspicions among the police. The autopsy revealed that 30-year-old Roxanne Wood had died from a stab wound to the neck. Forensic experts found only one piece of evidence at the crime scene, a drop of semen in January 1987. DNA testing had not been conducted, so the evidence was stored in the archives. During their search of the house, police found no signs of forced entry. Terry told police that they had a problem with the back door of their home, saying it was not working properly. Roxanne was found on the floor next to the kitchen cabinets, and the cutlery drawer was open. A fillet knife was missing, leading police to believe that it was the weapon used in the crime. Police found it strange that an intruder could enter the home without a weapon. When police looked into Roxanne's case, all information pointed to her husband, Terry, as the suspect. The investigation into the couple revealed that both Terry and Roxanne had been unfaithful to each other. When the police discovered this, they considered jealousy as a possible motive for the crime, especially on Terry's part. However, Roxanne's relatives did not believe Terry was capable of such violence. Although they acknowledged that he could be rude, yell, and insult others, they did not think he would commit such a brutal act. They believed that someone else was responsible for the crime. Despite their suspicions, the prosecutor's office determined that there was insufficient evidence to charge Terry with Roxanne's death. After the investigation, there were still no new clues, so the case was stalled. For many years, the case remained unsolved. Many Nels residents blamed Terry for Roxanne's death. He was often cursed in public, with people calling him a beast and a monster. Despite this, Terry continued to live in Nels, working for his father's company, keeping his personal life private, and avoiding contact with journalists. A year after the tragedy, in 1988, Roxanne's younger sister Janet married Terry's brother, Robert Wood, who also worked at their father's steel tank manufacturing company. Janet and Robert were the only ones still actively searching for the criminal, even though the police had given up and believed the case would never be solved. In January 1999, there was a significant development in DNA research related to the Roxanne Wood case, which had stagnated for 12 years. A DNA sample from the crime scene was added to the National DNA Database, but no matches were found. Terry, Roxanne's husband, agreed to provide his DNA for comparison, but it also did not match the sample from the crime scene. 20 years went by, during which a significant amount of information was gathered regarding the case. In February 2020, police brought in a professor and a group of students from Western Michigan University to digitize the case materials and enter them into an electronic database. The students worked on roughly 3,500 pages of handwritten reports, notes, and other relevant information. The professor noted that after 30 years of collecting data, police may have overlooked important details during the investigation. Around the same time the students started digitizing the data, the police investigating Roxanne's case reached out to a company that specializes in genetic genealogy. However, a new issue arose. The semen samples from the crime scene were poorly preserved. The usable portion was only about 3% of the amount normally needed for research. They had never worked with such a small amount before. However, the researchers still tried to identify the criminal's DNA. The experts spent about 10 months on the project but were ultimately unable to produce any results. Their efforts were in vain. The president of the genealogy company was very upset about the failure of the project. One day, the president of the genealogy company discussed this issue with his employee, Gabriela Vargas, and asked her to take over the project, promising to support its progress. In April 2021, Gabriela began her work. Colleagues considered Gabriela to be one of the most talented researchers in genetics. A few months later, Gabriela created a genetic profile using DNA analysis. She quickly discovered that the man was of Balkan Caucasian origin. Using the online service GED Match, Gabriela was able to build the criminal's family tree. Police identified the killer's parents, a couple born around 1920 who had 3 sons. This meant their sons were likely born in the 1940s and 1950s. With information from Gabriela, police quickly identified 3 brothers, eliminating 2 as suspects. That left only one brother who had a significant criminal record. Michigan State Police believe they have finally identified Roxanne Wood's killer after 34 years, Patrick Gillum. In February 2021, Patrick Gillum, 60, lived just a few miles from Roxanne Wood in South Bend, Indiana, where she also worked. Patrick was an alcoholic and a drug addict. When police looked into his criminal record, they discovered that 8 years before Roxanne was murdered, he had been charged with assaulting another woman. Back in January 1979, a young mother named Maureen Farrick lived in Gary, Indiana, with her husband Robert and their 2 daughters, ages 3 and 2. Maureen was an art teacher at a local high school. Robert described his wife as beautiful, kind, and social, always ready to help others. In September 1979, as Robert's business trip was coming to an end, he planned to return home late that evening. He called his wife, informing her that he didn't have the house keys, and asked her to leave the side door unlocked for him. After 11 p.m., as Robert was walking home, he noticed several police cars parked near his house. Maureen had run out and told him that a stranger had attacked her that night. She was sleeping on the second floor with her daughters when she heard noises coming from downstairs. Concerned, she decided to investigate and went downstairs to see what was going on. She noticed a man going through her purse. When he saw her, he pushed her to the ground near the stairs and tried to attack her, but he was unsuccessful. He eventually stole her purse and escaped. Maureen remained silent throughout the incident, fearing that her daughters, who were sleeping on the second floor, would wake up. After the attacker left, she called the police and provided a description of him. About a week later, Patrick, 24, was stopped by police for a traffic violation. An officer noticed credit cards next to him that belonged to Maureen Farrick. Patrick was arrested and taken to the police station. During questioning, he explained that he had entered Maureen's house through an open side door and that he had stolen her purse. In January 1979, Patrick Gillum was charged with burglary and unlawful deviant behavior. He pleaded guilty at his trial and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. However, he served only 7 years in an Indiana prison before being released on parole for good behavior. In February 2021, police began searching for Patrick Gillum to collect a DNA sample to compare with the profile of the criminal in Roxanne's case. In May 2021, they found Patrick Gillum, 66, in South Bend, Indiana. While driving his pickup truck, he threw a cigarette butt out the window. Police took the cigarette butt, which contained his saliva, and sent it for analysis. A few days later, the test results did not match, surprising the police. They were certain that Patrick was involved in Roxanne Wood's case. They then decided to take another DNA sample from Patrick, suspecting that they might have accidentally taken the wrong cigarette butt. In July 2021, Patrick was under continuous observation. One day, he visited a laundromat, and a police officer watching him decided to wait nearby, believing Patrick would eventually come out. The officer positioned himself on the sidewalk next to the laundromat. His prediction came true when Patrick stepped outside, lit a cigarette, and sat just a meter away from him, unaware that he was being watched. The officer greeted Patrick, and they exchanged a few words. After about 2 minutes, Patrick returned to the laundromat, leaving behind a cigarette butt. The officer collected the cigarette butt with gloves, bagged it, and sent it for forensic analysis. The analysis showed a near 100% match, but the police decided not to immediately arrest Patrick. Instead, they planned to bring him in for questioning. Patrick was told that the police needed to discuss an old case with him. During Patrick's questioning, the police asked him if he knew anyone named Roxanne. He replied that he knew 2 people by that name. One was a stripper, and the other was an alcoholic. They then showed him a picture of Roxanne and asked if he recognized her. He said he had never met her. They showed him both old and new pictures, but he continued to deny ever seeing her. When the police informed Patrick of what had happened to Roxanne, he became anxious. His body tensed, his hands shook, and he slammed his hands on the table, seemingly hoping that the interrogation would end. Throughout the interrogation, Patrick maintained his innocence, often answering questions with phrases like, "I don't remember," or "I don't know." The interrogation lasted for 5.5 hours. Eventually, Patrick stated that he needed a lawyer, and he was allowed to go home. 7 months later, in February 2022, Patrick was arrested at his home in South Bend, Indiana. Around the same time, nearly all local media reported on the reopening of this high-profile case. Following this, a woman contacted the police to share a story she had kept to herself for nearly 35 years. In January, just a few months after Roxanne Wood's death, Patrick attempted to attack another victim in South Bend. It was an evening when Rose Perrell decided to water her garden. While she was outside with a hose, she heard a car drive by. A Chevrolet El Camino stopped near her house. Rose initially ignored it, but when she finished watering and turned to go inside, she noticed a man wearing a black baseball cap and a black beard getting out of the car and walking toward her. Rose sensed that the stranger intended to harm her, so instead of returning to her house, she ran to her neighbors for safety. Thankfully, they quickly opened the door and allowed her in. Trembling with fear, Rose called the police. But by that time, the unknown man had already disappeared. A few days later, while driving around town with her husband, Rose spotted the same Chevrolet El Camino parked at a gas station. There was nobody inside the vehicle. Rose's husband decided to keep watch over the empty car while she went to find a phone to call the police. When Rose returned, she found her husband confronting the stranger. Her husband held a gun and told him to stay put. The man was 32 years old, with dark hair and a thick beard. Rose asked him to show her his driver's license. She read out his name, Patrick Gillum. Rose and her husband then allowed Patrick to leave but warned him that they would use force if he came near their home again. Rose then went to the local police station and reported her situation, also naming Patrick Gillum. She never saw him again and believes the police took no action. It wasn't until 35 years later that Rose recognized Patrick on the news and decided to share her story. She believes that if the police had taken her testimony seriously in 1987, the Roxanne Wood case could have been solved much sooner. In April 2022, Patrick's trial finally occurred. He did not confess to the crime and claimed he had no memory of the events. When Janet Wood spoke during the trial, Patrick appeared horrified as he looked at her. Janet and Roxanne resembled each other closely, leading some to believe that Patrick thought he was face to face with Roxanne, which frightened him. Ultimately, Patrick Gillum was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 19 years. All suspicion was cleared against Roxanne's husband, Terry Wood. Terry was emotional and confused, crying in the courtroom. For 35 years, he had been the prime suspect in his wife's murder, and now justice had been served. He continued to avoid the press and kept his private life private. Roxanne's family finally found peace. Her siblings Janet and Brad were relieved to learn the truth. Janet shared that after the trial, she had a dream in which she and Roxanne were walking near the cemetery gates. They were laughing and talking. As Roxanne told Janet that it was time for her to leave, she reassured her loved ones not to worry or cry, saying that she was fine. Zoe Hastings was born on November 21, 1996, in Kansas. She was the oldest of 5 children, with 3 younger sisters and a brother. Zoe was always there to help her parents look after her siblings, ready to cancel any plans if her parents needed a hand. Her mom and dad were deeply religious, so the family spent a lot of time at church. At some point, they moved to Dallas, where Zoe enrolled in a high school with a focus on creativity and arts. She had a passion for drawing and also enjoyed participating in school theatrical performances. In her spare time, Zoe worked at an art studio in Dallas. She also worked as a lifeguard at a local pool during a summer break. After graduating from high school, Zoe had the opportunity to attend some of the top universities in the country. However, she chose to postpone her education and dedicate some time to her church. In October 2015, when Zoe was 18, she was getting ready to go on a mission trip for her church and was eagerly anticipating the journey. On Sunday, October 11th, she planned to attend the Sunday service, where they would discuss some details of their upcoming trip. Zoe took the family minivan, promised her parents she'd be back for dinner, and left her house around 4:40 p.m. The church was only a few miles away, and her parents expected her to return around 6:30 p.m. However, as time passed, Zoe didn't come back for dinner, which was quite unusual. They sent her several messages, but there was no response. They also tried calling her, again with no luck. After some time, they started calling her friends and family members, thinking Zoe might have visited someone after the service. But none of them had seen her that evening. Finally, her parents decided to call the church. And here they encountered a rather unexpected turn of events. Zoe never showed up there. Her parents became even more worried and decided to contact the police. Such behavior was extremely unusual for their daughter. She always told them where she was going and never disappeared without any explanation. They called 911, but for some reason, the officers didn't come to their house to take a missing person report. So the parents drove to the police station themselves, filed a report, and began searching for their daughter. They retraced the entire route from home to the church several times but couldn't find any trace of Zoe. This went on almost all night, and as morning approached, her mother suddenly had an idea. She recalled that her daughter had an iPhone tracking app, which gave them access to her location. They discovered that her phone was just a few hundred yards from the church, near a small creek across the road from it. The parents immediately went to that spot. To their horror, they saw a lot of police cars, as well as an ambulance and emergency services. Approaching one of the officers, they explained they were searching for their daughter, and the officer informed them that there had been a car accident. A few hours earlier, the police received a call from a person who was walking his dog. At one point, a man approached him, said that there had been a car accident near the creek, and a woman was injured. They both ran to the scene, where the witness found this woman in a pool of blood and called 911. The police quickly identified the deceased. It was Zoe Hastings, but they immediately realized that she hadn't died as a result of the accident. It was obvious from the first look that she had been a victim of murder. Zoe lay on the ground a few hundred yards from the minivan, which was partially submerged in the creek. There was a lot of blood near her body, and police officers noticed multiple cuts on her neck. Zoe's dress was pulled up, and her underwear was rolled down, leading detectives to assume that the killer likely assaulted her. Zoe's parents tried to approach their daughter, but the officers stopped them, saying they shouldn't witness such a gruesome scene. While investigating the crime scene, officers found several clues. All the minivan doors, except the driver's, were locked. This could indicate that the perpetrator either drove the vehicle themselves or approached Zoe directly at the scene. A few yards from the creek, near an embankment under the bridge, police found a blood-covered knife, which was likely used as the murder weapon. Zoe's smartphone helped investigators establish the timeline of events. GPS data revealed that she arrived at the creek at 5:01 p.m., just 20 minutes after leaving home. And apparently, she was killed within minutes of that moment. Police also found out that after leaving home, Zoe made one stop. She went to a DVD rental service near her local Walgreens to return a movie. While experts examined the victim's body and all the available evidence, detectives decided to look for potential witnesses who were at the store or nearby at the same time as Zoe. After speaking with dozens of people, they managed to find two potential witnesses. The first was Lester Clark, who worked at a tattoo parlor next to the store. On that day, around 4:45 p.m., he went to buy cigarettes and saw a woman near the DVD rental service. Shortly after, Lester saw her returning to the parking lot and approaching a white minivan. She tried to open the door, but at that moment, a man got into the driver's seat, and they drove away. Detectives showed Lester a photo of Zoe, and he said that the woman did indeed resemble her. Despite finding the scene quite tense, he didn't think much of it as nothing obviously bad seemed to happen. The witness also provided a description of the man. He was short, heavily built, and African American. Lester was standing at a considerable distance from the parking lot, so he couldn't make out any other features. Later, as it was getting dark, he noticed the same man again walking toward the store alone. The second witness was a homeless man named Gary Whitman, who shared a similar story. Around 4:45 p.m., when he was across the street from the parking lot, he saw a woman heading toward the white minivan. Suddenly, a man approached her from behind, preventing her from getting into the car. He then took something out of his pocket and showed it to the woman. After that, she got into the car, moved to the passenger seat, while the man got into the driver's seat and drove away. Gary provided a similar description of the suspect and added that the situation struck him as highly suspicious. He went into the store and asked the clerk to call 911. However, it's unclear if the clerk complied with his request, as police found no records of this call. While investigators interviewed witnesses, experts made several discoveries. The forensic pathologist examined the victim's body and found traces of male semen, but the amount was so small that conducting a full DNA analysis was simply impossible. This only confirmed that the perpetrator had sexually assaulted the victim before the murder. Investigators also examined the victim's car and couldn't find any foreign fingerprints on either the doors or the steering wheel. Based on witness statements, the suspect could have driven Zoe away from the store parking lot in her minivan, which caught the detectives off guard. However, they didn't rule out the possibility that the killer may have simply wiped down the steering wheel and door handle after the murder. Several hairs were also found on Zoe's body, but experts couldn't extract a full DNA sample from them as they were too small. But when they examined the knife found near the crime scene, they finally had a breakthrough. A DNA sample was discovered on it, which was immediately uploaded to the FBI database, and police got a match. The sample belonged to 34-year-old Antonio Cochran. The man had a lengthy criminal history dating back to his teenage years. He had been arrested for thefts, assaults, home invasions, and was also suspected of numerous other crimes. The year before these events, in 2014, a 17-year-old daughter of his girlfriend accused Antonio of sexual assault. According to her, he offered her a ride, but once she was in the car, Antonio took her to a wooded area, threatening to kill her if she tried to escape. There, he assaulted her and the man was arrested. He claimed they had consensual sex, and the case went to court. However, during the trial, the prosecution couldn't provide enough evidence to prove his guilt, so Antonio was found not guilty. With his DNA found on the knife, police identified Antonio as the prime suspect, and he was arrested. During the interrogation, he repeatedly denied any involvement in the murder, so the detectives focused their efforts on finding more evidence. The experts took a DNA sample from Antonio and tried to compare it with the hairs and semen found on the victim's body. Since both pieces of evidence were too small to extract a full sample, experts decided to try a different type of analysis. They were able to generate an approximate profile and determine if it definitely did not match the chosen DNA. In other words, this method operates on the principle of exclusion, but it does not yield any precise results and cannot be used as proof of guilt. They compared these partial profiles from the hair and semen with the suspect's DNA and concluded that their similarity couldn't be excluded. Meanwhile, detectives examined Antonio's smartphone and found several interesting text messages. Putting them together, it became clear that on the day of the murder, he was in a very troubled state of mind. At 1:48 a.m., the day before Zoe's death, he texted a friend he lived with, saying he was moving out and he would never see him again. On the next day, at 2:07 p.m., he texted his ex-girlfriend, telling her that his stepmother had died. He mentioned she died right in front of him, and he was finding it difficult to cope with the loss. Over the next hour, Antonio texted another woman twice, stating he had been drinking all night, driving around the city, and crying. These were his final messages before Zoe's death. Later that evening, at 9:30 p.m., he texted his friend again, expressing confusion about what to do with his life and how things had recently taken a turn for the worse. The next day, he sent another message to his ex-girlfriend, saying his life was over and she would soon find out why. Examining his browser search history, detectives found that Antonio had visited local news websites over 30 times before his arrest, specifically checking the crime sections. 5 of those visits were directly related to articles about Zoe's murder. They also noticed that prior to her death, he hardly ever visited news sites. Police only found one page in his history related to gang activity. Antonio's smartphone gave the detectives another lead. Experts obtained GPS data from his cell phone provider and discovered that at 4:34 p.m., his phone connected to a tower covering the area where the store was located. This coincided with the time Zoe was there, but this data wasn't considered strong evidence. It only indicated that his phone was within a few miles of the tower. Nevertheless, It suggested that Antonio arrived in the area just minutes before Zoe left the parking lot. His home was quite far, and throughout the day, his phone had been connected to a different nearby tower. Detectives also learned that Antonio had started a new job at a grocery store just 3 days before the incident. On Monday, the day after the murder, he didn't show up for his shift without giving any explanation. Despite the extensive list of circumstantial evidence against Antonio, the only strong evidence remained the suspect's DNA on the handle of the knife. However, this could have posed a problem, as such evidence alone is often insufficient for a conviction because merely holding a knife doesn't prove the act of murder. For instance, he could have used the knife under different circumstances, and someone else might have used it to commit the crime. But detectives couldn't find any other evidence, so they decided to proceed with the case and take it to court. The prosecution presented its version of what happened that day. When Zoe returned to the parking lot to her car, Antonio approached her, pulled out a knife from his pocket, and threatened her to get in the car. He then took the driver's seat himself and drove away. Based on messages sent by the suspect before the murder, he was in a distressed emotional state due to the death of a relative and had consumed a significant amount of alcohol. According to the investigator's version, he decided to abduct the victim with the intention of assaulting her. He chose Zoe randomly because she happened to be in the parking lot at that moment, and Antonio simply saw an opportunity to commit the crime. The man drove her to a nearby creek nestled in a low-lying area surrounded by trees, making it difficult to see from any direction. There, he forced the victim out of the car, assaulted her, and inflicted 6 stab wounds to her neck area. He then got back into the car and attempted to drive it into the creek, possibly to conceal any remaining evidence in the vehicle. However, the car only partially submerged in the water, so Antonio could have wiped the steering wheel and door handle clean of his fingerprints and fled the scene. According to the testimony of the first witness, he saw a similar-looking man returning to the store's parking lot on foot that evening. The defense argued that the majority of the evidence could hardly be considered even circumstantial. For instance, the partial analysis of hair and semen only indicated that Antonio couldn't be excluded as the source of these samples but didn't conclusively prove his involvement. Regarding the DNA on the knife, the defense seized upon the fact that this evidence alone didn't establish the fact of the murder. According to their version, Antonio could have come into contact with the knife under different circumstances. Before working at the store, he had a job at a movie theater where he sometimes had to collect various items left behind by visitors, including knives. But no evidence was found to support this version. Moreover, if someone else had taken the knife from the theater and used it to commit the murder, they would have had to somehow avoid erasing Antonio's DNA from the handle, which would have been quite a challenging task. The defense also attempted to challenge the credibility of the second witness, the homeless man Gary. It turned out that he had an active arrest warrant in his name for violating the conditions of his parole. The defense tried to use this fact to exclude his testimony from the case files, but the prosecution objected. In their view, the fact that a person with an active arrest warrant voluntarily came into contact with the police indicated that he genuinely wanted to help. Gary himself stated that he was just trying to do the right thing, knowing that he would be arrested because of it. Antonio's lawyers also tried to convince the jury that at the time of Zoe's murder, their client was elsewhere helping a friend, but no substantial evidence supporting this version was presented. Initially, the prosecution sought the death penalty for Antonio, but during the trial, it became clear that with the available evidence, this would be highly problematic. Therefore, they abandoned these plans. After prolonged deliberation, the jurors eventually found Antonio guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Zoe's parents thanked the investigators and all the participants in the trial for achieving justice for their daughter. Her father also shared that from a young age, he had warned all his children about the dangers the world might pose to them. He had exerted all his efforts to protect them, but his eldest daughter was abducted just a few hundred yards from their home, and he couldn't do anything to prevent it. The case of Angie Dodge. Angie Dodge, who worked as a sales clerk at a cosmetics store in the summer of 1996, had just bought her first apartment in Idaho Falls and moved out of her mother Carol's house. In her neighborhood, Everyone knew each other, and doors were rarely locked. The area was quiet and prosperous. However, Angie had only lived in her new apartment for 3 weeks, and she could not have foreseen what was about to happen. Angie and her mother had a strained relationship, often arguing. Carol believed that her daughter had grown up and wanted to be independent and that she did not need to control Angie. On Thursday, June 13, 1996, Angie was supposed to go to work at the cosmetic store, but she never showed up. Worried, a friend went to check on her at her apartment. When he arrived around 11 a.m., he found the door unlocked. When he entered, he discovered Angie lying on the floor with multiple injuries and immediately called 911 for help. Police quickly arrived at the crime scene and found no signs of forced entry into the apartment. They also discovered that Angie had fought for her life. She had been abused and stabbed multiple times. Her mother Carol was devastated by the tragedy that had befallen her family. Police were able to collect a semen sample from the attacker, providing DNA evidence. They then began collecting DNA samples from local men and interviewed Angie's friends and acquaintances, including 20-year-old Chris Tapp. Chris initially denied any involvement, but under pressure from the police, he admitted that he, Angie, and 2 other friends had been in her apartment on the night of the incident. A fight broke out, and one of the men attacked Angie with a knife. During this time, Chris held her down to prevent her from escaping. Chris Tapp was arrested, but throughout the trial he maintained his innocence. He alleged that another man named Mike was responsible for Angie's death. Chris's DNA did not match that of the real attacker. However, on May 28, 1998, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Although Chris Tapp was in custody, Angie Dodge's case remained unsolved because the DNA found at the crime scene did not match Chris Tapp. Police spent time trying to identify the source of the DNA, but their efforts were unsuccessful. The case died down. Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, was determined to find justice for her daughter. She believed that the real culprit was still at large. In February 2009, DNA evidence collected from Angie's apartment was sent to the National Crime Database, but no matches were found. Carol then consulted a DNA expert who advised her on a new technique called familial DNA searching. This method allows police to search databases of convicted criminals to identify relatives who may have similar DNA. Carol went to the Idaho Falls Police Department and the district attorney's office reporting her plan and asking for police help. The police were interested in Carol's suggestion. In the summer of 2014, police officer Patrick McKenna searched a public DNA database from a major genealogy company called Genealogy. He discovered that a DNA sample in the database matched 97% of the DNA found at the crime scene. Patrick believed he had identified a relative of the suspect. The police then obtained a search warrant to discover the identity of this relative, later identifying him as Michael Ussery Jr. In December 2014, more than 18 years after Angie Dodge's death, police went to Michael's home in New Orleans. They asked him if he had ever been to Idaho Falls. Michael replied that when he was 19, he had gone to Idaho Falls to visit friends. The police then obtained a warrant and collected a DNA sample from Michael. He felt uncomfortable with the situation and asked for a lawyer. Michael searched online for information about the Angie Dodge case, and what he found scared him. He became concerned about what the police might do next and began staying home instead of going out. He believed that his phone calls and online activities were being monitored. Although he knew he was innocent and had nothing to do with the case, he began to suspect that his father might be the one who committed the crime. Michael participated in a genealogy project at their local church, and his DNA appeared in a public database. A genealogy company called Genealogy later purchased the database, leading to the police finding a match. On January 1335, Michael Ussery Jr. received an email with the results of his DNA test confirming that his DNA did not match that of the criminal, clearing him of all suspicion. The genealogy company, which had lost the trust of its customers due to security issues, then made its database private, which was no longer available to the public. Michael later created a documentary about his experience. Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, then contacted Michael to discuss an important matter. When they met, Carol asked Michael to write down the names of all of his relatives on his father's side. Carol and Michael grew closer when he decided to help her find the criminal who had caused her grief. He created a family tree on a piece of paper, revealing that Michael's grandfather had 6 brothers. However, it was also possible that some of the relatives were illegitimate. By this time, Chris Tapp had been in prison for nearly 20 years when the Angie Dodge case again attracted media attention. Reporters contacted him, and upon viewing a 20-year-old interrogation video, Chris claimed that his confession was false, stating that the police had forced him to confess on camera. Carol, Angie's mother, does not believe that Chris Tapp was responsible for her daughter's death. More than 20 years later, Carol is still working to find the real killer. Mike Heavey, a retired Supreme Court judge, believed that Chris was innocent and spent 4 years trying to prove it. After watching the interrogation videos, he realized that Chris seemed to be unaware of important details. Mike Heavey concluded that Chris was forced to change his story 6 times during 9 interrogations. Although the police recorded all 7 polygraph tests, no one took the time to review the recordings. Mike Heavey, along with a polygraph expert, believes that the polygraph tests were used to coerce Chris into lying. The police broke protocol during the polygraph test by threatening Chris with a gas chamber, believing it would not be detected. Mike Heavey reviewed the evidence and determined that Chris had been manipulated and coerced into confessing to a crime he did not commit. Mike Heavey hoped that the polygraph recordings he found would be enough to grant Chris Tapp a new trial. In March 2017, Chris Tapp was 1 hearing away from a decision that his attorney believed could lead to his release. However, the sheriff argued that Chris's testimony, coupled with the absence of his DNA at the crime scene, did not prove his innocence. The district attorney's office proposed a plea deal. Chris would maintain the charges related to Angie's death, but the conviction for Angie's abuse would be dismissed. His sentence would be reduced by 10 years, allowing him to be released immediately since he had already served 20 years and could be eligible for parole. Chris Tapp accepted the deal and was released in 2017 after serving 2 decades in prison. After his release, Chris Tapp found a job, got married, and began living a normal life. Meanwhile, Carol continued to search for the real criminal. She believed that modern technology would help her solve Angie's case. On May 1639, the sheriff announced that they had arrested a man whose DNA matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore and her lab have made significant progress in solving cases through genealogy and public databases. Angie's case was the 56th they solved, and they successfully traced a family tree that identified the real criminal who was connected to the Usry family. The police secretly collected DNA from the men by following them for days and searching for discarded items such as cigarette butts, soda cans, or plastic straws. They took DNA samples from all 6 men, but the results were surprising. None of the samples matched the DNA from the crime scene. Police began investigating the family's children who were not listed in the family tree. They later identified a man named Brian Drips. The police discovered that they had interviewed Brian at the beginning of the investigation into the Angie Dodge case. He lived just across the street from Angie's house. When Carol Dodge heard this, she exclaimed that it took her 23 years to find him, and he lived right across the street. The first 25 pages of the investigation detail the interrogation process, but the criminal report indicates that on the day of the tragedy, a young officer conducted a brief interview with Brian. He claimed he knew nothing about the incident and did not hear anything from his neighbor. The police did not ask him to undergo a DNA test. About 7 weeks after the tragedy, Brian moved from Idaho Falls to a new apartment. Later, the police located him and discreetly collected a cigarette filter that he discarded near his residence. His DNA matched the DNA found at the scene of the tragedy with 100% accuracy. Brian was brought in for questioning and appeared very nervous, with shaking hands. For hours, he denied any involvement in Angie's death. However, when the police informed him that his DNA was found at the crime scene, his demeanor changed significantly. Ultimately, Brian admitted that he was involved in the case and acted alone, which meant that Chris Tapp could not have been present. 2 months after Brian's arrest, Chris faced a retrial and was completely exonerated. In October 2020, Chris Tapp filed a lawsuit against the city of Idaho Falls and the Idaho Falls Police Department. The city agreed to pay Chris $12 million in compensation for the 20 years he spent in prison before being exonerated. Chris acknowledged that no amount of money could compensate for the more than 20 years he spent in prison for a crime he did not commit. But life goes on, and he continues to move forward. In 2021, during the trial, 56-year-old Brian Dripps pleaded guilty to the abuse and murder of Angie Dodge. He confessed that he was drunk and using illegal drugs that night. Brian Dripps was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years, meaning he could be released at the age of 76. Tanya McKinley was born on January 25, 1961, in the small American town of Milton, Florida. Growing up in a loving family, she shared a close bond with her older sister. They enjoyed playing outside together, skateboarding, and bowling. After finishing high school, Tanya decided to move to Pensacola, about 25 miles away from her hometown. She wanted to explore the medical field and focused on one of the quickest professions to enter, a medical transcriptionist. No medical degree was required to become one. All Tanya needed was to attend special courses. Her cousin, Vanetta, chose to relocate with her, and the two women shared an apartment to save on rent. Soon after moving, Tanya met a guy named Tim, and they began dating. Eventually, they moved in together, and in 1983, their son, Timothy, was born. While Tanya was thrilled to become a mother, her relationship with Tim wasn't perfect. They argued quite often. 84, Tanya temporarily moved in with her cousin, who by that time had a husband and 2 children. Tanya planned to find a place of her own and move out as soon as she gets the opportunity. On December 30th, and move out as soon as she gets the opportunity. On December 31st, Tanya, along with Vanita and her husband, decided to celebrate New Year's Eve at a local bar. They left their kids at a late-night daycare and set off to ring in the new year. They had a lively evening, filled with laughter and dancing. Tanya also saw a lot of familiar faces at the bar. When midnight struck, they welcomed the new year of 1985, and Vanetta, with her husband, prepared to head home. The daycare where they had left their children was closing at 1 a.m., giving them just 1 hour to pick them up. But Tanya wanted to stay at the bar a little longer. Given that her sole focus had been on work and caring for her son for the past 2 years, this was her only opportunity to unwind and relax, so she didn't want to miss it. Tanya asked her sister to pick up her son from the daycare, and Vanita agreed. Since they lived together and Vanita had to collect her own kids, it wasn't a problem. Before parting ways, Vanita asked Tanya how she planned to get home since they had arrived at the bar in their car. But Tanya assured her that she would easily find someone to give her a ride, considering the fact that there were many familiar faces at the bar. On the morning of January 1st, Vanita woke up and, to her surprise, realized that Tanya had not returned yet. It seemed odd since she should have been back long ago. Vanita thought that Tanya might have gone to stay with one of her friends, so she wasn't overly concerned initially. But everything changed soon after. Vanetta's worried mother-in-law knocked on their door, delivering the shocking news: Tanya had been found dead. That night, around 3 a.m., a Pensacola resident and her daughter headed to a vet clinic due to some urgent health issues with their dog. However, as the woman left home, her daughter noticed something strange on the roadside. She thought it was a mannequin and mentioned it to her mother. The woman decided to take a closer look and was horrified to realize it was a human body. She immediately returned home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman lying in an empty lot near the road. Her tights were pulled down, the dress was lifted, and her shoes were missing. Next to the victim, they discovered a blue towel with red stains resembling blood. Police identified the deceased as 23-year-old Tanya McKinley. A few streets away, they discovered her shoes, along with a purse containing an ID in her name. The body was handed over to medical experts while investigators continued to examine the crime scene. It was quickly established that the victim was likely killed elsewhere. There was no blood near her body except for the towel stains, and there were traces on the ground indicating that the body had been dragged from the road towards the roadside. On the towel and the victim's body, police found their first potential leads. There were several human hairs as well as pubic hairs and dog fur. They assumed that the first two samples belonged to the killer, possibly someone with a dog. Medical experts determined that Tanya suffered a blow to the head with a heavy object, but the cause of death was strangulation. They also confirmed that the victim had been sexually assaulted. The experts collected a semen sample from her body, but in those years, DNA analysis had not yet become widely used in forensics. All they could establish was that the suspect had type B blood. Considering that these clues didn't lead about the issues in their relationship and constant arguments, both before and after the birth of their son. It turned out that when Tanya decided to end the relationship, Tim was against it. He didn't want to part ways with Tanya and continued trying to persuade her. Tim consistently called Tanya, visited her, and behaved as if he couldn't accept the breakup. Investigators considered that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed Tanya to the bar, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. They brought the man in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. Tim also agreed to provide hair samples. Although experts couldn't extract DNA from them, they were able to compare the hairs under a microscope, which would have been sufficient enough to establish similarity. However, Tim's hair significantly differed from those found on the victim's body and the towel. Based on this fact, he was temporarily ruled out as a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to everyone who was present at the bar on New Year's Eve. They questioned Vanita about any individuals who might have behaved strangely or aggressively towards Tanya, but she insisted that the evening had passed without any incidents and proceeded very well. The police also discovered that after breaking up with her boyfriend, Tanya briefly dated a man named Kurt. He happened to be the bartender at the same bar where she celebrated the New Year, and it was his shift that night. They spoke with Kurt, but he claimed no involvement in the murder. According to him, after finishing his shift, he went to a New Year's party with friends. Investigators interviewed his friends, leading to an intriguing discovery. They confirmed Kurt's presence at the party, but said that he didn't arrive immediately after ending his shift at the bar. Gathering all the testimonies, police concluded that theoretically, Kurt had enough time to commit the crime. Through multiple interviews with individuals from the bar, detectives determined that Tanya was last seen alive at 1:15 a.m. However, no one witnessed her leaving the bar. The police also interviewed residents in the area where the body was found. One family recalled driving by that spot around 2 a.m. and stated they were certain there was no body. Investigators established that Tanya was killed within a little over an hour and a half from the last time she was seen alive, and Kurt didn't have a solid alibi during this specific time frame. He agreed to a polygraph test, and the results were inconclusive, showing deceptive answers to some questions. But the lab experts determined that Kurt's blood type did not match the blood type of the killer as identified from the semen sample, so the man was eliminated from the list of suspects. Police continued their search for other potential suspects, but their efforts led to dead ends. The analysis of the killer's semen wasn't possible, and they lacked any substantial evidence or witnesses, quickly hitting a dead end in this case. The only thing investigators were nearly certain of was that the perpetrator must have lived in the area where the body was found. This location was secluded from main roads, situated at the edge of an extensive residential area. Police doubted that an unfamiliar perpetrator would go there with the victim's body in a car without any knowledge of the area. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years. Timothy, who was only 18 old when his mother died, was raised by his father and Tanya's family. They all decided to shield the child from the truth about what happened to his mother. As he grew older, relatives told him that Tanya had died in a car accident. This continued until he turned 14. With Christmas approaching, the boy grew curious about the gift his father had prepared for him. Timothy decided to search through his father's closet only to stumble upon something far more chilling than a mere present. He found a letter written by his father addressed to the popular TV host, Montel Williams. In the letter, the man asked him to mention the unsolved murder of Tanya, hoping that the publicity would help move the case forward. Timothy read detailed accounts of the murder in the letter, and that's how he learned the true fate of his mother. In the early 2000s, the local police department reopened Tanya's case, hoping that advancements in DNA analysis would help identify the killer, so they sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Upon examination, experts concluded that the blood on the blue towel found near the body did not belong to Tanya, but to an unknown man. They obtained his DNA profile and uploaded it to the FBI database, but there are no matches. The case went cold again until it was reopened in 2015, exactly 30 years after the murder. The killer's DNA still had not appeared in the FBI database, prompting detectives to try a different approach. Modern tools allowed them to search not only for exact matches, but also for partial ones. They considered the possibility that the database might contain relatives of the killer, which could lead them to the suspect. They began to search and eventually narrowed their focus to a specific individual from the FBI database. His DNA shared some patterns with a sample from Tanya's killer, but the resemblance was relatively weak. Police delved into his family background, even reaching out to his relatives. They agreed to assist and even provided their DNA samples for comparison. After examining the samples, experts reached a disheartening conclusion. They found that this family had no connection to the suspect, leading the detectives once again with no substantial leads. In 2018, journalist Tony Adam took an interest in this case. Despite not specializing in crime, his personal interest in this subject drew him to the unsolved murder of Tanya. He wanted to help and reached out to the investigators handling the case. Detectives approached his willingness to help with a degree of skepticism. While an experienced journalist, Tony had no background in criminal investigations. However, given the lack of progress in the case, police figured he couldn't make things worse. The journalist joined the investigation and established connections with Tanya's family. They could see his genuine interest in resolving the case and the significant effort he was putting into it. For instance, he worked to garner media coverage for the case, bringing additional attention to it. He also brought a fresh perspective to an investigation that had lingered for over 3 decades. A year later, in 2019, detectives decided to make another attempt to find the killer's relatives. This time, they sought assistance from Parabon, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. In their previous attempt, investigators had only looked for potential relatives through the FBI database, which contained samples from various criminals. However, Parabon examined public genetic databases significantly broader in scope. Anyone could upload their DNA sample to these databases for purposes such as finding relatives or exploring their ancestry. Experts diligently worked through potential relatives of the killer, methodically examining their family trees to identify someone fitting the criteria of their suspect. They sought a man who, in 1985, was old enough to commit the crime and lived in the area. This process took almost a year, presenting an incredibly challenging task for the experts. However, in February 2020, they finally identified a man who theoretically could be the killer. It was 57-year-old Daniel Wells, who lived in the same city at the time of the murder. Detectives delved into his background and found that Wells had come to the attention of the police several times. In the late 80s, he was arrested for assault and later for indecent exposure. As of 2020, Daniel continued to live in Pensacola working as a carpenter with a wife and children. But detectives needed a sample of his DNA for a direct comparison with the killer's profile to establish his potential connection to this murder. Due to the absence of any solid evidence, police proceeded cautiously with Daniel, fearing he might flee once he realized he had been identified. They put him under surveillance and soon, the police got an opportunity to obtain his DNA. Daniel threw a cigarette butt out of his car window near his workplace. Investigators seized it and immediately sent it to the lab. Experts extracted DNA from the saliva on the filter and compared it with the killer's DNA from Tanya's case. The result showed a perfect match. 35 later, the police finally identified the perpetrator, and on the same day, he was arrested. Despite having the results of his DNA analysis, investigators wanted to obtain a confession from Daniel, so they chose to proceed cautiously and refrain from revealing all their evidence at once. They asked patrol officers to pull over the suspect's car under the pretext of a standard ID check. Detectives then approached Daniel and told him that he needed to go to the station with them. They deliberately withheld any additional information, keeping him in suspense. During questioning, investigators slowly directed the conversation towards Tanya's murder, asking about Daniel's whereabouts that night. Initially, he denied ever knowing the woman, and that's when detectives revealed that his DNA was found at the crime scene. Daniel continued to deny everything but grew increasingly nervous with each question. Detectives emphasized the undebatable nature of the DNA results, leaving him no chance of avoiding consequences. They made it clear that the only way to ease his situation was to confess, and it worked. At some point, Daniel began to speak. Initially, he tried to justify the presence of his DNA by suggesting that he might have had sex with Tanya on that night. But detectives didn't believe this version and continued to demand the truth. And eventually, Daniel confessed to killing Tanya on that New Year's Eve. However, his story raised some serious questions. He admitted to being at the bar where he met Tanya, who mentioned she was looking for a ride home, so Daniel offered to help. According to his story, they went to his house where they drank and engaged in consensual intimate intercourse. But then, an argument erupted between the two, and Daniel claimed he can't remember the cause of it. The situation escalated to the point where Daniel, in a fit of rage, grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board and struck Tanya on the head. Realizing she had died, he panicked. Daniel took her body to the location where it would later be discovered and left it there. On his way back, he disposed of her belongings and returned home. When asked about the dog hairs found on the victim's clothes and towel, he explained that his roommate had a black Labrador, and those hairs were indeed black. Daniel's story sounded like an attempt to minimize his own responsibility. It was hard to believe that Tanya willingly engaged in consensual sex with him, only to have such a severe argument minutes later that led to her death. He also claimed that she died after the blow to the head. However, medical experts had undeniable evidence that the cause of death was strangulation. A more plausible scenario would be that Daniel attempted to assault Tanya and she resisted. He then struck her on the head but quickly realized she was still alive, leading him to strangle her. Despite the fact that the suspect's confession probably didn't align with the actual events, the detectives had everything they needed. Daniel was arrested on charges of murder and placed in custody. Right after that, investigators contacted Tanya's relatives, including her son, to deliver the long-awaited news. Timothy couldn't hold back his tears and thanked the police for finally finding his mother's killer. However, Daniel wasn't destined to face a judge and serve time for his actions. Just 2 weeks after his arrest, his lifeless body was discovered in his cell. The examination indicated that he had taken his own life. Tanya's relatives were disappointed by the fact that the murderer had escaped the prospect of spending decades behind bars. Nevertheless, in the end, they found some closure in knowing that after 35 long years, the case was finally solved. The case of Emily Murray. Emily Murray is a college student. She was born on February 19, 1980 in Sleepy Hollow, New York. Emily lives with her parents and 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. They are very close and are in constant contact with each other. Emily's father works as the director of a science center. Thanks to his job, her family lives comfortably and can afford everything they need. Emily is a gifted student with a great passion for science, especially medicine and philosophy. In addition, she is a devout Christian, like her family. Since she was a child, she has helped her parents and found ways to earn money, but she often donates what she earns to charity, leaving very little for herself. After graduating from high school, Emily enrolled in Kenyon College to continue her studies. She focuses on philosophy and hopes to work for the church and participate in various missionary activities. During this time, she also traveled to Italy, New Zealand, and Japan, with each trip related to her church charity work. In February, Emily entered her 3rd year of college, where she studied hard and got closer to her dream. She was actively involved in church activities and participated in youth ministry. She also envisioned a large family, imagining herself with her future husband and their children. Tragically, no one expected her life to end so suddenly. On November 3, 2000, at the college Emily attended, her roommates woke up to find that she had disappeared. The girls remembered that Emily could sometimes get caught up in her work, as there were times when she stayed late to finish an important project with a friend. Emily had worked a shift at a restaurant the night before, leading to speculation that she might have stayed late and then gone straight to college to study. Her roommates, therefore, continued their normal routine, going to work and continuing their studies, expecting to see Emily later. However, she did not return that night, and they became increasingly concerned when she failed to show up at the planned party. A few days earlier, Emily had gone to the local supermarket and bought all the necessary items, indicating that she intended to attend. Emily's friends were worried and contacted Emily's sister to check if Emily had returned to her family. However, Emily's sister said that she had not returned home either. Her sister called her parents to report that Emily was missing. It had been nearly 24 hours since Emily had gone missing, and her parents were distraught when they learned of the situation. Despite their efforts, Emily's friends were unable to find any useful information. Just a few hours after her sister's call, Emily's parents got in their car and drove to her school. At that time, a group of volunteers, including dozens of students, had searched the area for Emily, but found no trace. It was also confirmed that Emily's car was missing along with her. Emily's parents went to the university security office to report their daughter's disappearance. However, they were disappointed to find that the staff did not care. The staff assumed she was just out for the night and said that their daughter would be back soon. The family believed that this was not Emily's normal behavior, as she always informed them of her plans. Not a day went by without her contacting family and friends. Now, she was unusually quiet and ignored all attempts to reach her. Emily's roommates accompanied the family to the security office, and all three emphasized that this behavior was unusual for Emily. All of Emily's belongings were still in her room, including her bank checks and a wallet full of documents and cards. This suggested that she had no intention of leaving for a long time. All of her textbooks were also left behind. Finally, the security staff agreed that a search was necessary. They decided to start by thoroughly searching Emily's room. However, they found nothing suspicious. As a result, they created a missing persons notice and began distributing flyers to students on campus. Meanwhile, Emily's family contacted the sheriff's office to report their daughter missing. The police carefully reviewed all the details surrounding Emily's disappearance and checked her room. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, they began tracking her down from the evening she went missing. Emily worked at a restaurant near her school. Its proximity to the school and diverse menu made it a popular hangout for students. The restaurant was open until 2 a.m. every night, attracting a large crowd of young people. However, the police quickly realized that the late-night schedule could attract potentially dangerous individuals. Local girls knew that it was unsafe to go to the restaurant alone at night because of the many drunk and rowdy. On November 1st, Emily was working her last shift at the establishment. She was well liked by everyone for her positive attitude and friendly demeanor. The police compiled a list of everyone present, as these people were likely the last witnesses to see Emily. They could provide information for the search or report any suspicious activity that night. The restaurant closed at 2 a.m., as usual. Most of the customers had left, but Emily and a few other employees stayed behind to finish their work and clean up. Among the employees was Emily's friend, a waitress, who worked with her at the restaurant. Emily's time card showed that she finished her shift at 3:07 a.m. and left the restaurant. This was confirmed by Gregory McKnight, a chef who had left earlier that night as scheduled by the staff. The staff working in the store said that at around 3 a.m., they all finished their work and started to go home. Emily's parents were frustrated by the slow pace of the investigation. Despite the collection of valuable evidence suggesting many leads to follow, some believed that Emily might have left on her own. When the police inquired about her mental health, they discovered that although she had been depressed in recent years, she did not have any serious mental health issues. This depression may have been related to her heavy responsibilities at school and work, as well as her recent breakup with her boyfriend, which further affected Emily's emotional state. After gathering all the information, the police searched Emily's dorm room. They found notes from her that contained some contradictory statements, leading them to question whether she might have taken her own life due to her depression. Emily could have made such a decision because of her mental condition. However, her family and friends dismissed this idea. They explained that during her bouts of depression, she behaved quite differently. Specifically, during those difficult times, she would cut off contact with her family and become very withdrawn, and this withdrawal increased over time. But now, things were different. Before her disappearance, she showed no signs of distress. She was still sociable, full of energy, and maintained relationships with others. In fact, she seemed fine and felt inspired by her work. The police spoke to Emily's friends who confirmed that she had been doing well recently. She was no longer troubled by her breakup with her ex-boyfriend and had even stopped taking the antidepressants prescribed by her doctor. Her life had improved, and she felt no need to continue the medication. During the investigation, the police found no useful information or leads. They decided to contact the FBI for assistance. The police suspected that if Emily had been kidnapped, she might have been taken across state lines. But this investigation also yielded no results. The police then spoke with Emily's ex-boyfriend. Friends described their relationship as loving, but often filled with conflict. Eventually, the couple realized they were not compatible and decided to break up. The police discovered that her ex had attended a party on the night of her disappearance. Multiple witnesses confirmed that he and Emily had been seen together. He was one of the last people to leave the restaurant in the early morning, along with other partygoers. While he may have watched over Emily's friend, there was no evidence that he intended to harm her. Throughout the evening, he spent time with Emily as a friend. During police questioning, her ex provided a verified alibi. He had left with friends and traveled to another city, quickly eliminating him from the suspect list. The police then focused on Emily's co-workers at the restaurant. Several employees noted that one co-worker had feelings for Emily and wanted to pursue a relationship with her, but she had rejected him. He was summoned to the police station for questioning, where he denied any wrongdoing, insisting that he was only friends with Emily. He mentioned that they had talked a lot the night before she went missing, as he rarely saw her compared to the other employees. Before leaving the restaurant at 11 p.m., he wished Emily well and rushed to a concert for which he had tickets. His alibi was confirmed, and he was no longer considered a suspect. The next suspect was Dave. Several girls reported that he had difficulty communicating with women. He often tried to pursue a relationship with a co-worker but was rude, making many people feel uncomfortable. Dave was eventually fired from the restaurant because of his aggressive behavior. The restaurant manager, Gregory McKnight, mentioned that he had heard about Dave making inappropriate comments to other employees. Gregory found Dave's behavior suspicious and reported it to the police, thinking it might be related to Emily's disappearance. However, witnesses stated that no one had seen Dave at the restaurant the night Emily went missing. Due to his suspicious behavior, the police decided to continue investigating him. They suspected that he may have been following Emily, possibly waiting for her after her shift while hiding on the street. He was taken to the police station for questioning, where he provided an alibi that was corroborated by several witnesses, leading to his removal from the suspect list. The investigation was then suspended due to a lack of solid evidence, as all avenues of investigation had proven fruitless. Each suspect had a credible alibi. Police believe that Emily may have either escaped or taken her own life. However, they require more evidence to support this theory. In the meantime, some of Emily's close friends disagree with these possibilities. As time went on, days passed without any sign of Emily. The university campus was covered with missing person flyers featuring her picture. While everyone believed she was missing, the police realized that the crucial 48-hour window to find her alive had passed. However, the investigation was still ongoing. The family did not receive any demands from the kidnappers. There were no calls or ransom demands, so the possibility of her being kidnapped was dismissed. Due to the uncertain safety conditions at the school, students were asked to walk in pairs. To address the dangerous situation, security forces were assigned to accompany students on campus. For Emily's family, this was the most difficult period filled with constant fear and anxiety. Her parents could not eat or sleep. They desperately searched for information about their daughter's whereabouts, but all their efforts were unsuccessful. An important discovery redirected the investigation. A month before Emily went missing, Ronald had a minor traffic accident. After the accident, the other driver got out of the car to check the damage and assist Ronald. During this time, Ronald discovered that the driver who caused the accident had several guns in the trunk of his car, which had been opened by the collision. Concerned, Ronald decided to call the police and report the incident. 2 months passed, and on December 9, 2000, officers from the sheriff's office were dispatched to a trailer park. They were supposed to inform the driver of the accident from October that he was being charged with complicity in a burglary. Thanks to Ronald's testimony, they were able to solve a series of crimes. The officers went to the address where the car's owner was registered, but found no one there. The trailer appeared to be abandoned, and next to it they found several cars in poor condition. However, before leaving, the officers noticed another car behind the man's house that stood out from the others because it was new. The car was checked against the database, and the police discovered that it was a green car that belonged to another vehicle that was also listed as missing. Officers passed this information on to the police investigating Emily's disappearance. The most surprising aspect for the police was the identity of the owner of the trailer where Emily's car was discovered. The trailer belonged to Gregory McKnight, a chef at the restaurant where Emily worked, who had previously tried to blame his co-workers for her disappearance. The police then obtained a search warrant for the trailer. An officer entered through a window and immediately noticed a terrible smell of decay. Inside, they found bloodstains, and upon further investigation, discovered Emily Murray's body wrapped in a rug. An autopsy confirmed that she had died from a gunshot wound to the right side of her head. More than a month had passed since Emily's disappearance, and now the investigation had to inform her family of the tragic outcome. Gregory McKnight, the prime suspect, was quickly arrested and questioned. He answered briefly and vaguely and appeared very guarded, as if he were closely monitoring what he said. When the police informed Gregory that they had discovered a body in a missing car, he stopped cooperating and requested a lawyer. The situation was made easier by the fact that Gregory was already wanted for burglary, which meant he could not evade arrest and could be held while the details of Emily's death were investigated. The trailer was thoroughly examined, revealing bloodstains and a bullet hole in the bodywork, which a forensic scientist identified as the scene of the murder. By this point, there was enough evidence to conclude that Emily had been murdered in Gregory's trailer. The forensic expert would need to provide a detailed report after the autopsy. The investigation continued, and after 2 days, a major discovery was made. Forensic scientists searched the area around the trailer for a murder weapon and decided to examine a nearby well. Instead of finding a murder weapon, they discovered a human skeleton. This skeleton appeared to belong to an older person, probably a male. The identity of this second victim remains unknown. Prior to these events, a young man named Gregory Julius had gone missing in the area. A forensic expert verified this connection. The details of his disappearance matched those of Emily's case. He had been reported missing about 6 months earlier in a nearby town. According to his girlfriend, Gregory Julius had left home to attend a college party with a friend named Gregory McKnight. He was the last person known to have seen Gregory Julius alive, and Gregory McKnight was called to the station for questioning. During questioning, Gregory McKnight stated that he did not know where his friend was. At this point, a search was underway for the missing man. He said that he had attended a party with his friend, Gregory Julius. However, he claimed that they had parted ways after the party and that he had not seen Gregory Julius since then. The police found no evidence that Gregory McKnight was involved in his friend's disappearance, so he was released. Gregory Julius's girlfriend recognized the clothing found on the body as belonging to him, and the medical examiner confirmed the identity of the body as indeed being Gregory Julius. Due to these new developments, Gregory McKnight was questioned again. He gave brief answers, carefully choosing his words, and avoided providing any substantial information. The police suspected that he was lying and hiding something, apparently trying to buy time. However, the police had strong evidence against him, as they discovered not only a body but also several bags of Gregory Julius's belongings in his trailer. Gregory McKnight was born into a dysfunctional family and grew up in Quincy, New York. At the age of 15, He was convicted of murdering a resident during a robbery and was sent to a juvenile detention facility. After his release, he married his wife, a former employee of the correctional facility where he had been held. The couple initially lived in his wife's mother's house before purchasing a trailer in Ray, Ohio. His wife said she suspected he was involved in Emily's kidnapping because he had become anxious and exhibited unusual behavior after Emily's disappearance. Despite her concerns, she tried to hold on to hope that her husband was not involved in the case. With this information, the police began to suspect that they were dealing with a dangerous killer. The prosecution collected all the items taken from Gregory McKnight's home, specifically a shovel, pruning shears, an axe, and a hunting knife. These items were sent for testing and found to have traces of Gregory Julius's DNA on them. The prosecutor sought the death penalty for Emily's murder. However, the judge ruled that the county, being the poorest and least populous in the state, could not afford a death penalty trial and could not guarantee that Gregory McKnight would receive a fair trial. As a result, the case was moved to another county, causing administrative delays. The trial did not begin until February 2002. During the trial, multiple witnesses testified that Gregory McKnight had secret romantic feelings for Emily, suggesting that he may have been obsessed with her. Although he appeared to have suppressed those feelings, Gregory McKnight often defended Emily when other boys bothered her. Generally, he seemed to be a friendly person. The restaurant's bartender mentioned that after Emily went missing, Gregory McKnight told him that he felt she was dead. Other co-workers noted that Gregory McKnight was seen leaving with Emily that night. The prosecution argued that Gregory McKnight knew it was Emily's last shift at the restaurant, which prompted his actions. They believed he met her after work and may have given her a ride home. During that ride, he confessed his feelings for Emily, but when she rejected him, he kidnapped her and then murdered her. Unlike the Emily Murray case, there were fewer witnesses in the Gregory Julius case. Evidence was also limited, but new information emerged during the investigation. It was discovered that the car driven by Gregory Julius had been sold shortly after his disappearance. Gregory McKnight's car was identified, and blood found in the back seat matched Gregory Julius's DNA, implicating Gregory McKnight in Gregory Julius's death. However, the motive for killing Gregory Julius remained unclear. With the evidence being so strong, the attorneys did not attempt to argue that Gregory McKnight was innocent and instead chose a different strategy. The defense argued that Gregory McKnight was struggling with mental health issues, claiming that he was unable to control his actions. Additionally, they argued that the victim, Emily, was mentally unstable and was contemplating ending her life, asserting that Gregory McKnight had helped her do so. This notion angered Emily's parents, who were deeply offended by the attorney's argument, as Emily was deeply religious and would never choose to end her life voluntarily. Despite the defense's various tactics, the jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. Gregory McKnight was convicted of first-degree murder for Emily's death, as well as kidnapping and burglary. He faces the death penalty. Emily's family is religious and opposed to the death penalty. However, Gregory McKnight was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murder of Emily, along with a life sentence for the murder of Gregory Julius, 10 years for kidnapping, and a year and a half for burglary. After his conviction, he filed several appeals, all of which were unsuccessful. More than 20 years have passed, but Gregory McKnight is still alive. He expressed his desire to be executed, stating that he wanted to die for his crimes, but later changed his mind. In 2020, Gregory McKnight began arguing that his sentence was unjust due to racial bias in his trial. He alleged that the all-white jury treated him unfairly and insulted him. Emily's parents remain confused about why Gregory McKnight killed their daughter and do not believe his assertions of his obsession with her. They felt that Gregory McKnight harbored resentment towards the college students he worked with at the restaurant, many of whom came from wealthy families, including Emily, whom he chose to take revenge on. However, because of their religious beliefs, Emily's parents believed that her death was not in vain, as it led to the arrest of Gregory McKnight and held him accountable for all the sins he committed, ultimately saving the lives of others. In honor of Emily, they planted a tree near the university. Every year on November 2nd and on her birthday, they release a red balloon into the sky in her memory. The family also plans to scatter the rest of Emily's ashes, which are currently kept in an urn at home. The first half of her ashes was buried in the church cemetery. Kaye Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989 in Rochester, New York. She was the only child in the family, and her parents gave her all their attention and love. When she turned 3, they decided to get divorced, and Kaye stayed with her mom. Her father maintained a good relationship with his ex-wife and visited his daughter all the time. Kaye's mom, Judy, moved to an apartment complex located in a quiet suburban area of Rochester. Despite her ex-husband helping to take care of their daughter, Judy had some financial difficulties. When Kaye was 4, her mom took on a part-time job to save up enough money for a trip to Disney World with her daughter the following summer. Judy's job was delivering magazines to customers in her neighborhood. On the evening of May 23, 1994, she was getting ready for her shift. She was sitting at home, placing leaflets into the magazines before heading out to deliver them. Around 6:45 p.m., Kaye asked to go out for a walk. It was a beautiful, sunny evening outside, and she wanted to ride her tricycle. Judy looked outside and saw that there were plenty of other kids playing in the yard, so she agreed to let her daughter go out for a few minutes. She told her to stay within the yard, and Kaye ran out onto the street with her tricycle. Judy had only a few minutes left to finish with the leaflets. After that, she planned to deliver the magazines and take Kaye to McDonald's. Once she was done, she grabbed the magazines and took them to the car, planning to call Kaye back home. But when Judy stepped outside, her daughter wasn't there. She looked around, called out her name, and there was no response. Judy walked around the yard, then began to roam the complex grounds, but Kaye was nowhere to be seen. The mother also didn't hear the sounds of her tricycle. When Kaye rode it on the street, its wheels made quite a noticeable creaking noise, but it was silent outside. With each passing second, Judy's panic grew, and her cries quickly gathered the neighbors' attention. She asked them if anyone had seen her daughter, but only a few people had seen her in the yard with other children and didn't know where she had gone. Upon learning that Kaye had disappeared, the neighbors joined the search, but they couldn't find her or her bicycle. Most of the complex territory was covered with trees, and around it was a fence separating the houses from the nearby highway. Judy was sure that her daughter couldn't have gone anywhere on her own. Kaye knew she was only allowed to ride in their yard, and she had never disobeyed her mother before. She also couldn't have gone far on her small bike, and she would have been found right away. Fearing the worst, Judy decided to call the police. Officers arrived on the scene within minutes and immediately began searching. Soon, they were joined by firefighters and canine units. While searching the complex and its surroundings, officers went door to door. The police strongly believed that Kaye was still somewhere at the complex. If this was a case of abduction, the most logical suspects were its residents. An outsider would hardly have been able to enter the premises, snatch Kaye from the yard, and drive away without anyone noticing. The complex had 300 units, and the residents willingly let the police in, sincerely wanting to help find the girl. In cases where no one was home, the complex manager used spare keys to let the officers inside. Unfortunately, all of this yielded no results. Kaye and her bicycle were not found in any apartment. The search continued throughout the night, and around 4 a.m., the case was reclassified as a kidnapping. A special unit took over, and detectives asked Judy if there was anyone in their lives who might wish them harm. They asked about Kaye's father, but Judy denied his possible involvement because he had absolutely no reason to kidnap his daughter. The detectives asked if there was anyone among the complex residents who behaved strangely or suspiciously, and Judy shared one observation. She mentioned a 22-year-old man named Mark who had recently moved into the complex with his wife and 1.5-year-old son. According to Judy, Mark's behavior seemed very unusual and even alarming. They had met a few times in the yard and engaged in small conversations. Once, he said her daughter was very beautiful. Judy had often heard similar compliments from others, but the tone in which Mark said it seemed weird to her. After that, he added something even more unsettling. He said he had been watching all the little girls in the complex, and Kaylee was the prettiest. Obviously, these words seemed highly suspicious to the mother, and after that, she tried to avoid any contacts with Mark. Although, they continued to occasionally see each other in the yard, and once he asked Judy a very alarming question. He inquired if Kaylee would tell her if someone tried to touch her. Judy answered yes and immediately left the yard, considering such questions extremely suspicious. Prior to these conversations with Mark, Kaylee liked to play with his son on the playground. But since then, Judy didn't let her daughter near him, even in her presence. During the conversation with detectives, Judy remembered something else. About a few minutes after she went outside to look for her daughter, she saw Mark in the yard, coming out with his son to the playground. She asked him if he had seen Kaylee, and the man said no. Judy also noticed something strange, but at that moment, she didn't pay much attention to it as her mind was preoccupied with fear for her daughter. She saw that his sneakers were missing shoelaces. The detectives decided to talk to Mark and brought him in for questioning. The man denied any involvement in Kaylee's disappearance and even agreed to take a polygraph test. The operator didn't detect any false answers, so Mark had to be released. Also, Judy herself basically provided him with an alibi as she saw the man on the playground with his son at the exact time when she was looking for her daughter. The police also searched his apartment in the early hours of the investigation, but they didn't find Kaylee's bicycle or the girl herself. Thus, Mark stopped being considered a suspect, and the detectives continued their investigation. With no leads in hand, they began to check Judy for possible involvement in her daughter's disappearance. Judy understood that this was a standard procedure and repeatedly answered all their questions. However, the fact that the police, lacking other suspects, were spending so much time on her only added to her suffering. Information about Kaylee's disappearance soon appeared in local news, as well as on billboards and flyers throughout the city. The police received numerous calls with tips, the total number of which quickly exceeded 1,000, and investigators quickly checked on each one. Unfortunately, they all led to dead ends, and eventually the case went cold for months. Despite the lack of progress, Judy never stopped hoping to find her daughter alive. She left her job and dedicated all her time to search. She's been printing and posting flyers, contacting various media outlets, and overall doing everything to keep the case in the public eye. She was also joined by some compassionate people who not only helped distribute flyers, but also managed to raise $100,000, which was offered as a reward for any useful information about Kaylee's disappearance. Judy even mentioned to get this case covered on national television. She was invited to the Oprah Winfrey Show, and information about her daughter's disappearance appeared twice on a popular TV show dedicated to unsolved crimes. Judy also collaborated with local businesses to have flyers with information about Kaylee's disappearance constantly present in their offices, establishments, and on commercial vehicles. She even persuaded 2 airlines to include these flyers in envelopes with tickets. All of this helped to gather new leads, and the police diligently investigated each one, but they never managed to come close to solving the case. This went on for 2 years until something unexpected happened. On August 9, 1996, a woman called the police and told them about a serious argument she had with her husband. According to her, she was tired of her husband's strange behavior and stated that she wanted to divorce him. In response, the man began to persuade her not to do that and tried to evoke her sympathy. While telling her how difficult things were for him, the man suddenly confessed to his wife that he had killed Kaye Poulton, plunging his wife into deep shock. The woman immediately took their child, went to her father's house, and called 911. Finally, she revealed her husband's name to the police. It was Mark Christie, Judy's neighbor. Detectives were surprised by his wife's story, but they immediately encountered a serious problem. Under the state law, any information shared between spouses was protected and could not be used in court. In other words, even if Mark wasn't lying, the police were not allowed to arrest or question him. Also, as we remember, the man's apartment was searched in the early hours of the investigation, and he's been in the yard with his child shortly after Kaylee's disappearance, so the police doubted he had the time to kidnap and kill her. Despite this, Detective Crow, who listened to Mark's wife's story, decided to talk to him. He found out that the man and his family moved out of Kaylee's complex just a few weeks after her disappearance due to some very serious accusations. It turned out Mark had been reported by the parents of 2 girls for standing naked in his doorway in plain sight. No investigation was conducted on this matter because technically he was in his own home, but the fact itself seemed extremely suspicious to the detective. Mark had moved to another city located 50 miles from Rochester, and Crow headed there. But he was met with an unpleasant surprise. Instead of Mark, his mother opened the door and said that her son wouldn't talk to the police without a lawyer present, whom they had already called. It seemed that Mark had learned about his wife's call to the police, and Detective Crow realized there wasn't much for him to do in this situation. Since a confession made to his spouse couldn't be used in court, Mark's lawyer could easily prohibit the police from speaking to his client, allowing Mark to continue living freely without fear of prosecution. But Crow wasn't ready to give up yet. While he was talking to Mark's mother, the man himself eventually came out, and the detective managed to convince him that he just wanted to ask a few questions about Kaylee's case. Crow suggested they drive to the nearest restaurant and chat over a cup of coffee. To his surprise, Mark agreed, but on the condition that the detective would take him to his lawyer afterward. They stopped at an Italian restaurant nearby, and during the whole time, the detective engaged in casual conversation with Mark, trying not to push things or pressure him. And this tactic paid off. While they were waiting for their order, Mark suddenly started talking. He expressed regret for what he had done to Kaylee, saying that his actions had haunted him for the past 2 years. According to him, he constantly saw Kaylee in the news and on flyers, and her face haunted him everywhere. Crow continued to proceed cautiously, not wanting to spook Mark with excessive pressure. He had known him since the early days of the investigation, but this wasn't their first conversation. Crow believed that Mark was proud of himself because he outsmarted police and avoided punishment. So the detective decided to play on his ego. He told Mark that he had indeed managed to deceive the entire team of investigators working on the case, and this tactic proved effective. Mark replied that he didn't want to sound like he was proud of himself, but the way he got rid of the bicycle was truly ingenious. Mark asked the detective if he wanted to know the details. However, he warned him he would only talk about the bicycle and nothing more. Crow continued to maintain a soft, even friendly tone to avoid scaring Mark and to gather as much information as possible, reassuring him that he didn't have to talk about anything he didn't want to. Then Mark stated that Kaylee's tricycle had been in his apartment for 3 days since her disappearance. He knew that police would search every apartment because when a child is in danger, they don't need a warrant. But there was some sort of loophole in the law. It allowed police to search for a missing child, but not for evidence. It means they could only search places where a child could fit. Mark quickly decided to cut the bike into pieces and hide them in different parts of the apartment that were obviously too small to fit a child. For example, he wrapped some parts in clothes and fit them in closets, while others he placed in small bags and took them out to his car. He then gradually disposed of them, taking the pieces far away from home. Police officers were stationed at the exit of the complex, inspecting each car. But like with the apartment, they were only looking for the missing girl, so the small bags didn't detract their attention. Listening to this, Detective Crow realized he had a strong chance of obtaining a full confession from Mark. He began to tell him that perhaps Kaylee's death wasn't his fault and it was a tragic accident. In response, Mark asked what present sentence he could face, and Crow replied that most likely it would be around 25 years. Mark said that it would be unfair to him to make him spend half his life behind bars away from his wife and son. He also added that for the past 2 years, he had been living in his personal hell, and that should count for something in sentencing. Despite the obvious lack of sense in these words, Crow continued with his tactic and told Mark that perhaps he should ease his suffering and tell what really happened. Mark replied that he is ready to confess everything, but only after talking to a lawyer. Of course, the detective understood that no lawyer would allow his client to confess to a crime, even if he really committed it, if there was no evidence against him. So he decided to be honest with Mark about this and added that in that case, Kaylee's parents would never know what happened to their daughter or if she suffered before her death. And then Mark replied, "She didn't suffer." The detective sensed that the man was ready to confess everything, so he said it was time to do the right thing for himself, his family, and God. Upon hearing this, Mark looked at the detective and finally admitted to what he had done. He repeated that the girl didn't suffer, and he said he had strangled her. He immediately added that he hadn't done anything else to her. According to Mark, that evening, Kaye came to his apartment and asked to play with his 1.5-year-old son. He let her in and took her bike to the kitchen. He knew Kaye's mother wouldn't allow her to come to this place, so he decided not to attract attention. Kaye went upstairs to the second floor of the apartment to the children's room, where she started playing with the child. About 10 minutes later, Mark heard Judy in the yard, calling her daughter's name, and he panicked. He realized that her mother would be furious that he had let the girl into his house without her permission. So Mark went up to the children's room and strangled Kaye with his bare hands. Detective Crow immediately had doubts about some parts of this story. It seemed much more likely that Mark himself lured Kaye into his apartment under the pretext of playing with his son, taking advantage of the fact that his wife was at work. There, he could have tried to molest her, and when he heard Judy calling her name, he might have become frightened that Kaye would tell her everything. The detective also remembered that Judy saw him outside wearing sneakers without laces, suggesting that he had used them to strangle the victim. This would mean that the crime was not as spontaneous, as he would have had time to think it over while taking the laces out of his shoes. Apparently, Mark tried to minimize the severity of his crime by changing some details in this story. But Crow understood that if he voiced his doubts, Mark might change his mind and refuse to say what he did with the body, and the detective needed to obtain this information. So he continued to play along and listen to the story. Mark claimed that after committing the murder, he took Kaye's body to the kitchen and left her on the floor. Then, he took his son and went outside to create an alibi for himself. He kept hearing Judy call her daughter in the yard, so he deliberately wanted to be seen by her and dispel any suspicions. After the woman saw him in the playground and went to search the complex territory, Mark returned home and placed Kaye's body in a laundry basket. Covering it with clothes. A few minutes later, he took the basket outside and placed it in the trunk of his car. By that time, there were already many people in the yard helping Judy look for her daughter. According to Mark, there was such chaos that nobody even noticed him. Mark also took his son with him and drove to the company where he worked as a security guard. He parked near the back of the huge building and left the basket with Kaye's body by the door, then drove around and entered through the main entrance. Given that Mark had the day off, he lied to his co-workers about forgetting something at work. The story didn't raise any suspicions, so Mark walked through the building and opened the back door from the inside. He took the basket with the victim's body and climbed onto a huge 30,000-gallon tank filled with liquid coolant. He opened the top lid and dropped Kaye in, first tying a heavy metal object to her. Afterwards, he disposed of all the victim's clothes, but specified that he didn't remove the victim's earrings. Once done disposing of the body, he returned home and immediately joined the search for Kaye with the other neighbors. Basically, he managed to remove the body from the complex even before the police got involved, and no one noticed anything. At the end of his confession, he stated that killing Kaye was a big mistake and he shouldn't have done it. Having obtained all the necessary information, Crow paid for their food and Mark left a $2 tip. Then, he willingly went with a detective to the station where he was arrested on a charge of murder. As soon as Mark's lawyer learned about his confession, he tried to withdraw it, but it didn't work out. Mark provided all the information voluntarily, and Detective Crow didn't break any laws. The police immediately went to Mark's workplace and opened the tank. 2 years later, the victim's body was still inside, although the degree of decomposition didn't allow experts to determine the cause of death or any other details. They could only confirm her identity, and Judy finally got to bury her daughter. Mark admitted his guilt to the judge and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison, just as Detective Crow had told him. The man's lawyer managed to negotiate a deal where his client had the kidnapping charges dropped and only faced punishment for the murder. But Mark's story didn't end there. In 2010, the police reopened an old case from 1988. A 74-year-old woman named Viola Manville was brutally murdered while taking a walk in a suburb of Rochester. Detectives had several suspects, including Mark, who was only 16 at the time, but he had passed a polygraph test during interrogation showing no signs of deception. Eventually, a man named Frank Sterling was arrested for the crime. At first, he denied his guilt, but after a relentless overnight interrogation, he confessed to the murder. After being in prison, Frank tried to appeal his sentence, claiming that the police coerced his confession and that by the end of the interrogation, he could barely comprehend what was happening. However, all of Frank's attempts to prove his innocence failed until 2010 when the case was reopened and all existing evidence was sent to the lab. Experts found a DNA sample from the suspect, which did not match Frank's but perfectly matched another inmate from the FBI database, Mark Christie. In 2011, at the age of 39, Mark confessed to Viola's murder and received an additional 28 years in prison. However, he did not disclose the motives for his actions and showed no remorse. As for Frank, he was released from prison after 19 years of wrongful imprisonment. He sued the authorities and received nearly $10 million in 2014. But just 3 years later, he died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Mark continues to serve his sentence in prison, but he may be eligible for parole in a few years. However, there are no guarantees of his release. It is worth noting that if investigators in Viola Manville's case had not fixated on another suspect and coerced him into confessing to a crime he didn't commit, Mark might have been incarcerated earlier and he wouldn't have had the opportunity to kill Kaylee. Unfortunately, things turned out differently. The case of Andreas Mendoza. On May 14, 2021, 34-year-old Reina Amador went missing. She was last seen north of Atizapán de Zaragoza in the state of Mexico. Before her disappearance, she had informed her husband Bruno that she was going to Zocalo Square in the historic center to buy mobile phone parts. She was accompanied by family friend Andreas Mendoza, a 74-year-old man, whom she had known for many years. When Bruno returned home at 8 p.m., Reina had not yet come back, and only 2 of their daughters were at home. He tried calling but she didn't answer. At 11 p.m., Bruno went to Andres' house to inquire about her, but Andres said he had no information about Reina and had not seen her all day. As a former police chief, Bruno immediately decided to report his wife missing and went to the police station to file a report. No one expected this case would become one of the most notorious and tragic in Mexico. On Saturday, May 15th, Bruno asked to see the security camera footage. The recording showed his wife, Reina, walking down the street where Andres lived, but she never left Andres' house. This was the last time she was seen at 8:40 p.m. Bruno went back to Andres' house, accompanied by his brother-in-law. They knocked on the door, but Andres insisted he knew nothing about Reina. Bruno asked him to open the door to ask a few questions. He opened the door slightly, and then Bruno forced his way inside. He said that Bruno wouldn't find anything there, but Bruno sensed that something was off. The lights were off, and everything in the house seemed normal at first. However, Bruno discovered cardboard boxes in Andres' room. His intuition told him to move the boxes, and underneath was an entrance to the basement. There, he was shocked to find body parts in several buckets. On the dining table, there were also remains, including a face and scalp that had been separated from the skull. Upon closer inspection, Bruno finds Reina's belongings and realizes that the remains are hers. As all this was happening, Andres attempted to escape. He rushed out of the house, but was quickly apprehended, prompting Bruno to call the police. 2 police squads located nearby quickly arrived at the scene. Confused neighbors, not understanding why Andres was being handcuffed, tried to assist him. The officers brought him back inside and seated him on a chair. Bruno questioned Andres about his actions. One police officer contacted the prosecutor's office as a search warrant was necessary. During the investigation, a dismembered body was discovered, and authorities suspected there might be more victims. This incident quickly became a hot topic nationwide. Friends and acquaintances of Andres were shocked. They insisted he was a calm and peaceful individual, even serving as the president of his neighborhood's civil council. When police executed a search warrant at Andres' home, they involved specialists from various fields, including criminologists, anthropologists, doctors, and forensic experts. They focused on the room with access to the basement. In addition to the bed, there were other items in the room such as clothes, a wardrobe, and a few photographs. When police went down to the basement, they discovered the dismembered body of a woman with her feet resting on a chair. Nearby, they found knives, a saw, and a machete. On a table, there were severed limbs in a pool of blood. Additionally, plastic containers held body parts and organs with some preserved in salt. The remains of the face and scalp, with the hair removed, were also located in the basement. Initially, investigators think there is only one victim, but they uncovered more evidence, including 12 cell phones, 12 SIM cards, cosmetics, women's clothing, wallets, shoes, necklaces, and various women's accessories. Several videotapes and several notebooks with gruesome notes were found, including list of women. In addition, the police also recovered 9 sets of keys, 2 scales, election documents, and more than a dozen photos of the victims. The most alarming discovery was the well-preserved faces and scalps, with hair removed. This evidence led police to suspect they were dealing with a serial killer. Andres was then taken to Barrientos prison, where he was held before his trial. He expressed a desire to tell the truth and confess to killing Reina. She worked at a cell phone store just a short distance from Andres's house. He often visited her at work and helped her out, leading many neighbors to believe they were related, with some even spreading rumors that he was her uncle. On the day she disappeared, they had arranged to meet and buy supplies for Reina's business, as they had done previously, which made her trust him. At 5 o'clock in the morning, she told her husband Bruno that she was going shopping with Andres. According to Andres's testimony, Reina came to his house and they began to argue. He said he loved she and asked her to have sex with him, which led to an argument. When she refused, he took a knife and cut her neck. After she fell to the floor, he began to beat her. Although she was still alive, he stabbed her in the chest multiple times. After killing her, he dismembered her body and put it in boxes to take to the basement. In the basement, he removed the face from the skull, stating it was so beautiful that he wanted to keep it forever. He soaked the remains in salt to prevent flies from appearing. This is something he admitted to. He also said that he buried 4 other women in the basement. However, notes in his notebook and photos show something else. One of Andres's handwritten notes, dated December 17, 1974, described one of his victims who lived on Colonia Hank Gonzalez Street in Ecatepec. According to the note, she went to another world at 5 a.m. The note detailed the weights of various body parts. The head weighed 4.5, the chest 1.5 kilograms, each rib and the right arm 14 kilograms, and the pancreas, liver, and heart weighed 4 kilograms. This victim was 28 years old. The gruesome details left a deep impression on investigators who had no idea how significant this case would become. In addition, at the crime scene, the police discovered a videotape that Andres had filmed, recording each murder. Many people could not understand his thinking. For numerous investigators, this case was the most horrifying they had ever encountered. The developments of the incident were unbelievable, like a horror movie. A few days later, the police began dismantling the foundation of the building to check if there were really graves in the basement. Civilian experts joined the police to assist in the excavation, continuing to search for remains and related evidence. Initially, excavation began in the backyard near the kitchen where numerous bones were discovered. Diggings then continued in the main room measuring 30 square meters, believed to be the entrance to the basement. During this process, several skulls and bones were found. A report indicated the discovery of 1,137 bone fragments belonging to at least 4 individuals. The investigation is still ongoing every day, and experts are surprised by the new findings. During this time, Andres confessed to occasionally consuming parts of his victims' bodies. This has led to rumors that he was involved in cannibalism, which has alarmed neighbors. They recalled that Andres had previously sold meat, which explains how he was able to meticulously cut up the bodies of his victims. Neighbors said that after the butcher shop closed, Andres would occasionally go from house to house in the area selling meat, allegedly sourced from Iztapalapa. They began to suspect that he was lying and was actually selling the victims' meat. They noted that he sold this meat at unusually low prices and often gave them more meat than they asked for. Andres was born in Oaxaca on November 29, 1947. Neighbors recalled that he moved to Atizapán in the 1980s. He lived in the same house as his sister, who asked him to collect rent from the tenants. He was known for being calm and reserved. 9 years before the investigation began, he opened a butcher shop, which allowed him to meet many people, including politicians. He served as the president of the Civil Council of Atizapán and was a member of a political party. He was generous and caring to the residents of the area. He often visited people's homes to understand their needs. Neighbors viewed him as a role model, and no one suspected him. There was another perspective to consider. Some people described Andres as depraved and having an unpleasant appearance. He frequently visited women's homes saying he wanted to help them, but often had more intimate intentions. He was known as an older man who spent time in bars drinking and socializing with women. In the building where he lived, one room was rented to a couple with a small child and another to a doctor. None of them noticed anything suspicious about him. Among the documents found in the building was a file for Norma Jimenez, who had been missing since August 6, 2011. She has light brown skin, a healthy figure, wide hips, a bruise on her right cheek, and a vertical scar on her abdomen from surgery. She was 39 years old when she went missing. On the day Norma disappeared, she went to work as usual in Barragán from 2:00 p.m. to 10:00 p.m. At around 10:15 p.m., she called her family to say she was on her way home. Unfortunately, she never came home. The reason was that Andres invited her to his house, promising a good payment. Instead, he stabbed her in the heart, dismembered her body, and buried the remains in his backyard. Another of his victims was a 20-year-old woman who worked at the Marina Bar. She was similar in appearance to Norma and was also short. She was last seen leaving her home on April 7, 2012. Andres stated that in the same year, he met two girls named Adrenaline and Gardenia, who also worked at the Barragán Bar. He confessed that he took them to his home, and when they refused to have sex with him, he killed them and buried their bodies in the basement. In February 2016, Flora Vizcaino, a 38-year-old woman, left her home and never came back. She disappeared on October 16th, and since then, there has been no information about her. It was only when police searched Andres's home that they found her papers. Flora was a mother of 2 teenage daughters and worked as a waitress. She was divorced and her daughters were staying with their father that weekend. She left home at 11 a.m. and sent messages to her daughters on Facebook that same day. As hours went by without her return, her family reported her missing. Flora's portraits were posted on social media, but nothing came of it. At work, she met Andre, who often invited her to lunch and gave her gifts. However, she refused to start a relationship with him, and this is believed to be the reason he killed her. At Andres's home, documents belonging to Rubicelli Georgios, 32, were found. She went missing on July 2039 and was last seen at a restaurant, a moment that was captured on a security camera. She had a 5-year-old son and she working at a bank. In her free time, she works as a delivery person for the Uber food delivery service. That day, despite having the day off, she decided to make deliveries to earn extra money. Her family became concerned when she did not meet her older sister at the airport as planned. When her sister went to her apartment, her sister found only her son, who had been left alone for 5 days in a locked apartment. The missing report of Rubashli was filed on July 27th. Her motorcycle was later found in the Shang Avier area, but there were no signs that she had been there. Andres chose attractive women as his targets. If they rejected him, he would lure them to his home, claiming he wanted to help them. When they arrived, he would gain their trust first, then secretly pull out a knife and stab them in the heart and neck. Once they stopped moving, he would dismember them. Because the women were beautiful, he removed their faces and scalps to keep them. He also cut up parts of their bodies to eat later using his skills as a butcher. The remaining parts were soaked in salt and buried in various locations around his house, such as the kitchen, backyard, or basement. He covered the graves with a thick layer of cement to mask the smell. After weeks of investigation, the police discovered 3,787 skeletons. The skeletons that were found underwent a thorough cleaning process. After which it was possible to determine which parts of the body they belonged to, allowing an approximate number of victims to be established. While the investigation was ongoing, Andres was transferred from Barrientos prison to Gutilbaja prison due to threats from other inmates who wanted to kill him for his crimes. Several days later, relatives of one of the missing women approached police to provide their DNA samples to compare with the DNA from the remains found. On December 2, 2017, March Duranta, 33, left her home, a few blocks away from Andres's home, at 80 am. She went to a bank branch to make some transfers and took public transportation that went to the El Campanario area. That day, her eldest son, who was 15, called her twice and she answered him, also giving her location. However, she then stopped answering his calls. A few hours later, when she did not return home, her husband and 3 children visited the police to report her disappearance. Since that day, they have not known anything. Marta had met Andres a few months earlier. He had offered her a job as a cleaner at the Civic Council office. When her family learned of her disappearance, they feared the worst, believing she had fallen victim to Andres. Among Andres's victims were Maria Maris and her 7-year-old son Edgar. They went missing on December 24, 2014. Since that day, neighbors had not seen them. Her sister Matilda explained that she was a single mother who sold candy from a cart with her son. Andres had offered to let her keep the cart at his house. The day Maria and her son went missing, they left home and told their family that they would not be going far. Hours later, the family started searching for them in the streets. The family gathered information from people living in the area, and only one person had seen them on the day of their disappearance. That person was Andres. He even offered to go with Matilda to the police so report Maria and Edgar missing. One of the neighbors who ran a grocery store recalled that a few years ago Andres had offered her tickets to a local festival and convinced her to go. Another neighbor remembered that Andres promised to buy her a cell phone if she visited him, but she declined. In total, 4,300 skeletons were found, including 18 women and 1 child. This figure was released after the completion of excavations at the crime scene. These skeletons allowed investigators to identify 19 victims. Experts conducted extraction, purification, quantitative assessments, and typing to create genetic profiles for the victims. This genetic material was then compared with DNA samples from at least 11 families. The analysis resulted in matches for 6 cases, identifying at least 6 victims, while 13 other victims still await identification. Investigations continue and the police are searching another house owned by Andres for additional victims. On March 18, 2022, Andres Mendoza was sentenced to life in prison. In Reina Amador's case, he also had to pay more than $50,000 in compensation to her family. Although 19 victims' remains have been found, it is believed there may be more as Andres claimed to have killed at least 30 women. It is important to remember that serial killers often act normally so as not to arouse suspicion. They can easily gain people's trust, are often well-liked, and hide their true nature behind a friendly facade. Stay vigilant. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.